I will talk about the 9th of April, today's date. Now, if you go up to a Norwegian and you say the 9th of April, most Norwegians will immediately know exactly which date you're speaking of in Norwegian history. So I have given some hints behind me to what date and time this refers to in Norwegian history. I will be doing several videos throughout the year about significant dates in Norwegian history, like the 9th of April today, the 8th of May, the 7th of June, the 17th of May, and 20th of July. All very significant dates in Norwegian history. Some for good reasons, others for not so good reasons. But today we will be talking about the 9th of April. And it's time to reveal to you what the 9th of April means if you aren't a Norwegian and doesn't know this from before. The 9th of April 1940 was the date in which Norway was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany during Second World War. So Norway had, during the First World War, maintained a neutrality line. We were not really directly involved in the First World War. We were left alone. We had maintained neutrality. And we intended to be neutral during the Second World War as well. That was the intention, for the country to stay neutral and stay out of the war. But things did not go as planned. No. What happened was essentially that Norway had great strategic value due to its connection due to its harbors and connection to certain pathways on the sea or harborways. It laid on a strategic position. For a long time in Norway, there were rumors that England could be interested in taking Norway, but it was actually Nazi Germany which invaded and occupied our country. There had been warning signs that this could happen for months, even years, but it had been, well, more or less ignored, and Norway was underprepared for the conflict. That was a major controversy, how Norway was underprepared in the aftermath of the war. So Norway had been at peace for like more than 150 years. Yeah, we hadn't really had we hadn't been part of any significant wars since the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of Napoleon during the early 19th century. We'll get more into that story around the time when I talk about the 7th of May, because that's the 7th of May relates more to that story. But today we'll be talking more about Second World War in Norway. So what happened was that the politicians didn't really take the threat of Nazi Germany as serious as we should. We didn't think that Nazi Germany actually would invade and occupy peaceful Norway. A lot of people didn't think that. Some did, and some were prepared, but a lot weren't. And when, of course, the date came, and when on the morning, the 9th of April, there were reports of ships starting to approach Norway and such, and as the morning progressed, it became increasingly clear that German warships were heading towards Norwegian cities and places, especially the capital, of course. So a German ship actually started sailing past Oscarsborg fortress, and that fortress was sort of a defense place intended to thwart warships, but normally ships passed through very peacefully, of course. We hadn't been war in Norway for a long time. But this day something was very off, and the people at Oscarsborg was very curious about this ship. So the commandant of the fortress, Birger Eriksen, was asked if I should let it pass, and he used a swear word, and seeing as this is an ASMR channel, I'm not going to use swear words. But so I'm going to replace his weird word with more of an okayish word. We asked if we should let it pass, and he said, "No, fire, for Christ's sake." Yeah. And and he did, but the fortress fired on the German warship. Many Germans lost their life that day, actually, when the ship drowned, because the ship was sunk. We sank the ship. So the remains of the ship still lies at the bottom of the ocean floor outside Belzak. I have actually visited Oscarsborg 2 times many years ago, so I know this. The ship lies on the bottom of the ocean floor even to this day, I think, or the remnants of the ship at least. But this action was actually essential because it gave the government and the king time to flee, because it delayed the German advance a little. So the government and the king successfully fled from the capital. But things, this is one crazy day in Norwegian history. It's an infamous date in Norwegian history. It's just so crazy what is to most Norwegians when we think about this. This happened 50 years before I was born, and about 50 years time before I was born, and it's just crazy for us Norwegians to think there's actually been war in our country, because when we think of Norway, we think of a peaceful country, so it's just so weird to think about. But what happened is, of course, more German ships after a while arrive, German planes arrive, and and it gets intense because the German warplanes pursue the king and the government as they flee northwards, and they bomb towns and places. Norway has pretty much become a war zone. Not why there are towns and cities in Norway that are completely safe. There are a lot of places in Norway that now are bombed because they try to capture the king and the government. Because they want them to stay in Norway. The Nazis' plan was to rule was that it would be easier to maintain control of Norway if the government and the king still were in their positions. So they wanted to force them to stay. So they pursued them with warplanes and stuff like that. And there's even an infamous scene or known scene from Second World War where they know what the royal family evades bombs, essentially, as bombs fly around them. It's crazy, but it actually happened. And of course that day something else happened as well. That day Vidkun Quisling, the leader of the National Party, the Fascist National Party, a party which didn't really have that much of representatives or anything. They weren't really a big party in any way. As they had their followers, but they weren't like one of the established big parties. Well, that day he decides to go into a radio station and, declare that because the government and king has fled, he and the National Party is now in charge of Norway. And he declares within what has become an infamous radio broadcast from the war. That radio broadcast of the 9th of April, in which Quisling broadcasted to the radio in his radio speech to all of the Norwegian people, is known in Norwegian museums, in Norwegian history books. It's just an infamous broadcast because he essentially declares that now what the government, the king has fled, he and his fascist party will take over power. There's no democracy in this. They just coup power. We just take it, essentially. And he declares that he will and his party will form the new government. And there are scenes where he sits in the king's chair to sort of form the new government. And of course during the war, Quisling was at the time prime minister. But he is not considered a legitimate prime minister in Norwegian history, of course. And of course, because of Quisling's actions during the war and allying with the Nazis and couping over power, and as such, he was executed shortly after the war, one of the last people to be executed in Norway, and he also actually was and his name became synonymous. Quisling, the name Quisling became synonymous with traitor worldwide. So yeah, that was his legacy pretty much. And you know, the Nazi regime in Norway, while a lot of Norwegians were against the Nazis, many Norwegians were unfriendly to the Nazis and German soldiers occupying Norway, because a lot of Norwegians didn't like them. There were Norwegians who followed the Nazis too, and the fascists. And these Norwegians often helped the Nazis, and actually made sure, unfortunately, that most of the Jewish population of Norway was taken. There were only a few Jews left in Norway. Like, Norway was one of the worst countries during the Second World War of Jewish persecution relative to the population. The Norwegian fascists were very thorough, you know, and a lot of that is of course also because it was the Norwegian fascist party which ruled Norway, and there were Norwegian fascist institutions during the Second World War, which cooperated with the Nazis, of course. You know, and the fascist flag was waving over the parliament. It was a horrible time for our country, and it has sort of stained the entire concept of fascism in Norway so much that fascism is not a popular concept in Norway at all, because most of Norwegians do not, even if they haven't lived in this time, they learned about this time, you know. The first few months or weeks and months there were war in Norway, until Norway eventually surrendered. But not all was lost, because the king and the government escaped to England and was in exile in London during all 5 years of the war, trying to help the resistance from there, because in Norway during Second World War there was a resistance. The guys in the woods, they were called. There were various resistant organizations which hid in the woods of Norway to strike at various German posts and various fascist institutions in Norway. Many of them became heroes afterwards. One of the most popular resistance fighters, who actually lost pretty much almost everything, almost all of his friends and such during the war, is someone called for Max Manus. And Max Manus is this man, which is Max Manus. And this is a film about him made in Norway, and he was a famous Norwegian resistance fighter, and he so much that we made a film about him. So this is a film about him, and about the events of the war. Another famous event is The King Snow. The title of this film is The King Snow. And The King Snow is about our king at the time, King Håkon, who refused because he got an offer or ultimatum from the Germans. But either he surrendered and return to the capital to be king under Nazi rule, or they continue to hunt him and take over the country. And King refused the ultimatum. He said no, he would not surrender. And this had probably made him this has helped make him a super popular and famous king in Norwegian history. He would not surrender to the Germans and the Nazis. You know, so The King Snow is a famous moment in Norwegian history. No, he would not surrender. And then you have a film here about various events of Norway from the Second World War. You know, all because there in this film you can see how the various peaceful towns and cities of Norway in the war are bombed and stuff like that. It's so crazy to us, especially to us younger in Norway when we look at it, because it's so unimaginable what has actually been war in our country. But it probably was war. It's a well-known event in Norwegian history. Now, during the Norwegian War, there were pretty much two people leading the fascist rule of a country. One of them was Quisling. Before the war, he was the leader of the National Party, and he had actually been a minister in some governments earlier too. And he was actually helping, and he was actually also involved during the events of the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, helping with charity and stuff like that. But of course, most people today remember him only because of his horrible actions during the war. He led the horrible fascist system in Norway, both persecuting Jews and opposition, and helping the Nazis establish their secret police in Norway. I'm not going to say the town I live in, but in my town, while my town was mostly a more peaceful place during the war, my town was actually where the headquarters of the Norwegian Nazi secret police was, or of the secret police in Norway was, the Nazi version of the secret police. So we know that there are probably people in my town who were tortured in those quarters, I would suspect. But it's just, and of course, it's just crazy to me to think about this, really. Like, just what it all happened. But of course, we have museums to it in Norway, many dedicated to the war and the events of it, so we know it happened, we know, of course, there were people who were opposed to the Nazis and Germans who were captured and tortured at various infamous prison institutions in Norway, which were used by the Nazis. The Nazis didn't, the Nazis wanted Norway. They thought Norway, the Nazis sort of saw Norway as that ideal place because it was the place where what sort of had to do with the Nordic myths and the Aryan race, was blonde-haired humans, the Aryan race, which they were so obsessed with. So the Nazis sort of had an obsession with Norway. They wanted Norway as allies, but a lot of Norwegians, while there were Norwegians who cooperated with them, there were many Norwegians who didn't, and who didn't like them. Some even refused to even talk to the German soldiers. So yeah, so we in Norway, we have that's also why the far right isn't really that popular in Norway. We have such a horrible history with the whole fascism thing due to Second World War, and of course decades later, the events of 20th of July 2011, when a fascist far-right nutcase launched a terrorist attack at our government and innocent youths. So the past in Norway with fascism is such that the far-right in Norway, the very far-right, well, is not very popular in Norway at all because of our past. And today, of course, Quisling is not someone you want to mention in a positive way in Norway. He is an infamous name in Norwegian history. He was one of the two leaders of the Norwegian rule. The other was a German high-ranking Nazi called for Josef Terboven. And Terboven and Quisling didn't like each other that much, but Terboven was at the time the Reichskommissar of Norway, or the actual ruler of the Nazi occupation of Norway. So he is also an infamous name in Norwegian history. He, if I'm not mistaken, he killed himself towards the end of the occupation, because when the Nazi rule fell in Europe, the Germans retreated from Norway. And that led to what Norway called the Liberation Day, which is the 8th of May 1945. And Liberation Day, and after that, you know, all people in exile returned to Norway, and there was celebration, waving of Norwegian flags, and just you can see these old pictures of celebration in streets and stuff like that. The type of pictures you probably could see in many other countries at the time. So yeah. Now during the war, the Nazis actually didn't allow certain types of radios because they could broadcast, because the resistance used radios to broadcast information and resistance messages. So the Nazis didn't allow this, and I can tell you what my great-grandfather on my father's side, actually, I want to tell you this because it's a story I've been told by my father. My great-grandfather, he was out bicycling on his cycle. No, not bicycle. Yeah, he was out cycling on his bicycle, and he had a radio in his trunk, you know. It was illegal. So a German soldier stopped him and said, "What do you have in the back there, or what do you have in the back of the trunk?" And he said, "I have a radio there," he said. And then the German soldier was just like, "Are you joking?" And he just let him pass, because the German soldier actually didn't bother to check the trunk, because he thought my great-grandfather was just joking. he thought it was a joke that my grandfather actually had a radio there. So my great-grandfather really took a great risk there by just telling the Nazi soldier outright that he has a radio in the trunk. And the German soldier just thought it was a joke, because surely no one would tell outright that. So we just let him pass without checking. I think that's a fun story. Anyway, so yeah, but the Nazi rule in Norway were not great. And of course there's something in Norway known as Tungtvann-aksjon, which is, and that was a resistance action in which the resistance blew up a station in Norway intended to produce a nuclear weapon. And in Norway, many people say that this actually delayed Nazi development of the atomic bomb, but this was essential for delaying them. So this is also a famous story in Norway. Anyway, it was not a good time in Norwegian history, and it has really, and that time, and the terrorist attack many decades later, has contributed to completely discredit fascism in Norway, like completely. So much that the very far right, if you go too far to the right in Norway, a lot of people wanted to stab you. And a lot of that is because of Norway's horrible past with fascism and the far right. You know, Norway, we don't want to forget our history in Norway. But fascism has actually really hurt us in the past. So I hope that just gave some non-Norwegians some insight into the events of the Second World War. I did of course not go in any details now, but you know, I just said some general things about the 9th of April 1940. And if you mention the 9th of April 1940 to a Norwegian, most Norwegians will of course immediately understand what time and date you're talking about. The 9th of April is well known in Norwegian history. We learn about it in schools and everything. Because if you are Norwegian, you have to know what this date means. Because the 9th of April was the day when our peace, which had lasted for over a century, concluded, and Norway was thrown into a war and a fascist rule for 5 years before we were liberated, and peace returned. And then came the rebuilding phase afterwards. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day and that you enjoyed just this short history lesson.